Welcome to the Ricci Flow Nutrition Podcast. My name is Cameron Borg. On this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Chandler Mars. Chandler Mars is a researcher in women's health with a focus on steroid neuroendocrinology and mental health. She has published and presented several articles on her findings, and she has also written a landmark book with Dr. Derek Lonsdale on the subject of clinical thiamine deficiency and its various manifestations. As a graduate student, she founded and directed UNLV Maternal Health Lab, mentoring dozens of students while directing clinical and internet-based research. Postgraduate, she continued at UNLV as an adjunct faculty member, teaching advanced undergraduate psychopharmacology and health psychology. Dr. Mars received her BA in philosophy from the University of Redlands, MS in clinical psychology from California Lutheran University, and MA and PhD in experimental psychology/neuroendocrinology from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Chandler runs a very popular website called Hormones Matter, where regular articles are published on a wide array of topics. She is also a dedicated powerlifter and continues to encourage many women to engage in physical activity through her Facebook group, Old Ladies Lift. I feel really privileged to have had the chance to speak with Chandler. Her book with Dr. Lonsdale is amazing and definitely one I can see becoming a classic in the decades to come. It's instantly one of my favorite books and one that I would recommend almost everyone read who's interested in health. Chandler is incredibly insightful and calculated, and the work she's doing to bring greater attention to the impact of thiamine inadequacy and women's health is inspiring. With all that being said, I hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you so much for coming to speak with me today, Chandler. I've been a huge fan of the book that you did, and I'd love to know how you got into working on thiamine deficiency disease and negative reactions to pharmaceuticals from your background.
It was a very winding road. One thing led to another. Negative reactions. I've been in women's health for a long time, and you may or may not be aware of this, but most drug testing is not done on women. And so we don't get the information regarding even dosing appropriately until it hits the market. So many drugs go out there that do just fine with men, give them to a woman, and it's an entirely different response. And one would expect that because there's an entirely different physiology. But I'll give you an example. Like Ambien was on the market for 20 years before they realized that they were giving women the equivalent of a double dose. And so that's the state of women's healthcare. And so it was very natural for me to get into, medication adverse reactions from that perspective, because they almost always happen with women. And I was very interested in women's health. And so when the Gardasil vaccine came out, we started seeing obviously a lot of reactions to Gardasil. And over the course of my research and others' research, I was connected to Dr. Derek Lonsdale, who is the co-author of the book and is, in fact, the driving force in this book. And this has been his life's research. And we began working together just on helping girls and young women recover from Gardasil. And so it slowly got into the mitochondria and into thiamine. And over the course of a few years, we decided that based on his insistence that we should do this book together.
Yeah, it's a really fantastic book. It's instantly gone to one of my favorites that I've read. It was a bit tricky to get through, but it was well worth the persistence. And it's centered around this B vitamin that not many people really talk about, thiamine. So could you just give maybe a little background about what is thiamine, where does it come from, and what are its basic functions?
Sure. So thiamine is vitamin B1, and it is responsible for a whole host of things. But its most important task is it drives the conversion of food into ATP. So it is required to get glucose into the mitochondria and turned into ATP. thiamine is responsible for driving metabolism, driving the creation of energy. We need it in the carbohydrate pathway, and we need it in the protein pathway, and we need it in the fatty acid pathway. So basically, everything you might want to eat requires thiamine to get it from its macronutrient status into ATP. And so without thiamine, we don't metabolize foods very well. And what that means is we don't produce energy very well. ATP is the energy that drives all cells. And so when you don't have sufficient energy, think of all the functions that require energy. Those begin to falter and eventually fail. And that is kind of the root of modern illness, is the inability to create sufficient energy to meet the chaos of the world. And that's how illness begins. And so that's the entire book is about that.
And why do we not really hear anything about thiamine? You know, you never, like I did 3 years of study at university and basically got told that it was in pork and that's about it. So why are we not talking about thiamine very much?
Well, it's interesting because we think we solved it with food fortification. And indeed, that went a long way to help thiamine deficiency. So thiamine is, as you mentioned, in pork, is a good source of it. It is in grains, but the primary source in the modern world is in fortified foods. And the problem with fortified foods is that in addition to offering the bare minimum of nutrients, they come with not only a collection of toxicants, but calories and sugars and all sorts of things. And so the demand for thiamine is not necessarily met by what's put in those foods, particularly with most Western diets that are very carbohydrate centric. And so we think we've solved it. Fortification took care of it. No one's starving anymore. Whenever you look in textbooks, you see pictures of thiamine deficiency. You see emaciated folks and or chronic alcoholics. Those are the two areas where it's most common. In fact, I'm in graduate school, actually since college. You're taught about thiamine deficiency and Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is a result of chronic alcoholism. But what most folks don't realize is, one, there's not sufficient thiamine in the diet, given all of the threats to thiamine status. But two, thiamine deficiency is everywhere where there is heightened sense of metabolic need. So if you have an illness, you need more energy to solve that illness. Your immune cells, everything needs energy. And so if you don't have the energy to solve it, you end up with chronic illness, and that becomes a cycle. If you have something like pregnant women, you need more energy than you do to grow a baby than you do as a non-pregnant woman. But our RDAs are set so low such that, say go 1.1 milligrams is the RDA, 1.4 for a pregnant woman. Which is abysmally low just in general. But then if the woman is vomiting excessively or just vomiting with normal morning sickness, she's losing all that. Or if you have an illness where you're vomiting excessively or you can't eat or any number of things, you're going to need more thiamine. But because of the way we've defined it classically, Wernicke's, which is late stage, and starvation, we don't look for it.
So broadly speaking, what are you mentioned threats to thiamine status? What's putting pressure on thiamine in the body in the modern world?
Everything. Everything that demands energy. I mean, think about it. But if we're carbohydrates, so because it's a central driver to carbohydrate metabolism, the more carbohydrates you consume, the more thiamine you need to run that through the mitochondria. Because if you don't have sufficient thiamine, then it never makes it into the mitochondria, and it goes into all these accessory pathways that end up with metabolic disease, inflammation and all sorts of other things, because those are just, pathways that salvage pathways, if you will, to deal with the excessive amount of carbohydrates that it can't shut through the mitochondria. So carbohydrates, all the crap in modern foods are a threat to thiamine. Excessive coffee, even regular coffee, tea, the tannins in that, alcohol certainly, but it doesn't have to be what we think of alcoholic status. If you have a normal glass of wine or two at night on a regular basis, that depletes thiamine. Medications are absolutely huge thiamine robbers, and there's any number of them that directly block thiamine uptake, metformin, for example. But most of them also damage the mitochondria by some mechanism or another. So if you damage the mitochondria, then in order to undo that damage, you need more energy. And if you need more energy, you need more thiamine. And so essentially, life in general, modern life, everything that makes modern life easy, fast foods, fast agriculture, fast this, fast that, demands more thiamine.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're getting battered from every angle, and where a lot of people are standing around with what might be considered subclinical or not deficient,
Absolutely.
but suboptimal thiamine levels. And we may not even know it. And one of the things you mentioned in the book that this could lead to is dysautonomia, or this imbalance in sympathetic parasympathetic activation. So what does this roughly look like when we start to get symptoms of dysautonomia?
Well, it looks like a lot of things. When your heart doesn't beat appropriately to the environment, so it's too much, too soon, too little, too late. So you get symptoms where, you stand up and you get either orthostatic hyper or hypotension. It just doesn't regulate appropriately. Panic attacks are very common kind of in the earlier stages, because panic is, it's your heart beating and you're not able to consume oxygen appropriately, and that you might get GI distress. Again, the too much, too soon, too little, too late type of things, where you're either constipated or you have diarrhea, or it oscillates back and forth because the sympathetic parasympathetic innervation is all askew, and so you get things that are not regulated very well. Gastroparesis, again, the digestive system is not working appropriately. And so you get things like that can become pretty evident pretty quickly. But you get a lot of other subtle things. You get temperature control, which, if it happens to accord at a later stage, if you're a woman, you think menopause, and maybe it's not. It could be very well menopause, but it could also be that you don't have appropriate nutrients to manage things like that. So there's a variety of symptoms, but if you just think of inappropriate regulation to the environment around you, that's pretty much the guiding principle of dysautonomic function.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was that pretty much anywhere where you need energy, which is everywhere, thiamine insufficiency can have an effect. And you talk a little bit about this idea of pseudohypoxia in the book, which is particularly fascinating to me because I work as a pulmonary technician, and I see lots of people coming in. They're measuring 99% on oxygen saturation, and they are gasping for air. They simply cannot get enough air, and I just wonder how many of them are thiamine deficient and can't convert anything into energy.
Yes, probably a large part, and you see that more and more with COVID and post-COVID. And I've always thought from the beginning of this pandemic that folks would benefit from not just thiamine, but especially thiamine, but a vitamin cocktail on a regular basis while they are fighting the illness. And instead, we give them all sorts of medications that deplete energy stores. I mean, they certainly may attack whatever the virus or the bacteria if we've got into a bacterial infection, but they do that mostly by depleting the organism's ability to synthesize or utilize nutrients, because every living organism needs nutrients, whether it is a microbe or it's a human. And so rather than feeding the body, feeding the microbes, feeding, and allowing them to do their thing, we tend to just kill things, kill this, kill that, stop this, stop that, and then hope somehow the human in which those things are happening survives it. And then we wonder why they come out of it being very worse for wear, and unable to do it. But the pseudohypoxia is particularly interesting because we can't even breathe without energy. And so we think of energy as the life, not energy as breath, as the life force. But in order to breathe, in order to use that oxygen in a way that is useful, you have to have ATP. And if you don't have ATP or sufficient ATP, then you can't breathe. And so really the life force is energy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I remember working and reading through this book as fast as I could, because every day I'd have someone who I'd go, oh, I wonder
I wonder. Yeah.
what's going on in the mitochondria, whether they can't convert anything into ATP, and that's why they're having these dysautonomic functions. Their breathing's all off. They can't seem to breathe enough. So I found that particularly fascinating. And you mentioned there that a cocktail of different nutrients are all responsible. There's a few great graphs in the book that show all of the nutrients required at each step of the citric acid cycle and beyond. And I was just wondering, because it's not just about thiamine, if you were to start supplementing with thiamine, what would other synergistic nutrients be that you would want to include in that? I know magnesium is a popular one.
Certainly.
That's mentioned in the book.
Magnesium is critical. The other Bs are very important. Alpha lipoic acid is important. As you get around the cycle and through the electron transport, CoQ10 is often required. But this leads into a different discussion, actually, that we should probably talk about, is that when someone has been ill for a long time, and maybe even with acute thiamine deprivation, I'm not as versed in that as well because I don't work in a hospital, but with chronic thiamine deprivation, they are not only depleted in a number of other nutrients because everything re-regulates relative to thiamine because thiamine's at the top. But when you begin to supplement with the thiamine, it becomes a very tricky process because of electrolyte balance in particular, but also because you don't know exactly what they need in the other nutrients, because what they need in the deprived state may not be what they need in the semi-repleted state, and so everything kind of fluxes, and it's difficult to manage, not only from the beginning, but at each juncture things change. So we like things, give a pill, you're done, everything's good. That's not how it works. Things wax and wane, your stressors wax and wane, but your needs change relative to the totality of the nutrients that are being given. And so when someone asks, well, can you give me a protocol? And I know people give protocols and they're good frameworks, but they're not absolute. And I think folks have to recognize that it's not as simple as just giving someone thiamine and magnesium and a multivitamin. I'd like it to be, but it's not. You often have to manage this, that, and the other thing. And as things change, you have to add different components. So having said that, some folks with chronic thiamine deficiency, when they begin thiamine repletion, they get worse. And sometimes it is just a lack of other B vitamins or a lack of electrolytes. But oftentimes it's because everything has been reprogrammed. And when you finally give it a little shot of energy, and it's like a car that sputters, and doesn't quite know how to do it. And so it becomes very difficult. And so some people have to start their thiamine repletion with like minuscule doses of thiamine, and they have to stair step it over a very long period of time before they can tolerate an actual effective dose that will do anything to improve their symptoms.
Yeah, there's a few mentions in the book about if you're in a state of chronic thiamine deprivation, the enzymatic machinery that deals with it is actually becomes dysfunctional. So it can take some time to get that machinery back up and running.
Yes, it can. And ideally, someone would be under the care of a physician, and could do IV thiamine and could do regular blood tests to see what is going which direction and what needs to come in, at what point. But such as it is, folks have to do this themselves. I just got a message from as an example, a message from a patient who was diagnosed with thiamine deficiency a year prior, but no one did anything. And when she tried to get treatment, she has severe thiamine deficiency, Wernicke's. The neurologist sent her a note saying, well, this is a nutritional deficiency. I can't do anything. I mean, she's got Wernicke's. And I'm like, that is like the classic neurological disease pattern. Its brain function is altered. You have white matter, you have lesions in your brain, and yet the neurologist doesn't think it merits his attention because it's a nutrition problem, and she should see a nutritionist.
Wow.
So that's
specialists,
the state of medicine.
Yeah. So I was wondering, because probably a lot of people, if once they, hear you speak on a podcast or read the book, might be interested in trying thiamine supplementation. Is there any danger of, if you're taking thiamine by itself, of actively depleting other B vitamins or other nutrients because of the way that
Well, it doesn't technically deplete them. It just starts using them, I guess, which is depleting them. But whereas they were kind of in a quiescent state because they didn't have the energy to run their respective cycles, and their enzymes are probably downregulated, so you weren't using as much. As soon as you start upregulating, you do need to have the other B vitamins going. Again, dosage, though, becomes very difficult to determine, and it's based on individual need. And there's a lot of trial and error unless someone has access to regular testing, which no one does anymore because we just don't test nutrients like we should. And so, yes, there is a risk. You can get low on riboflavin, you can get low on B12, you can get low on folate. You can become low on niacin, any of them. It just, and which ones you become low on is entirely dependent upon your diet and your exposures and your genetics and all of that. And that's why a multivitamin is good. However, some people can't even handle a multivitamin, so they have to take each B individually, which becomes very expensive, unfortunately, and very difficult to really manage.
Yeah, and something that becomes very clear in the book is that testing for thiamine deficiency is not very simple.
No.
Yeah. So what are some ways we could go about quantifying our thiamine status?
Well, so I would like, first read the book or read our website, Hormones Matter. We have lots of case stories. We have all sorts of information on thiamine deficiency and other topics. It's not the only topic we cover, but it is a primary driver in recent years. But clinically is how you can do it for the most part, and you can look at your medications too. You can look up type in your medication and type in thiamine next to it and see if it does anything. You may have to go a page or two in or more to find out, but oftentimes, or medication and mitochondria. And you start to see patterns. And so you can suspect that based upon your environment and your health, you're likely to need it. And thiamine is not the only vitamin everyone needs, but it's the only one we seem to miss. It's like everybody will try everything else until they get to thiamine because it's so entrenched that we've solved it. So some of the more severe symptoms, you might see the balance difficulties, and you can walk heel to toe. And if you can't walk heel to toe, then you might be having a problem with thiamine. If you've got tremors or twitches or anything like that in the peripheral nervous system, you might have a problem with thiamine. If you have GI symptoms, I mean, they did studies back in the 30s and 40s, which were highly unethical, but in a female psychiatric ward, they decided to uh, give groups of women thiamine deficient diets for extended periods of time. I mean, no thiamine whatsoever, just like fractions of a milligram for extended periods, and look at the results, and track them. They had them thiamine deficient for like 6 months in some cases. Yeah. And, but they made sure that the other vitamins were replete, so they knew that it was thiamine. But some of the first symptoms were, in addition to like kind of general malaise, mood, irritation, lack of energy, this kind of fatigue, was GI dysfunction. GI dysfunction, I mean, your GI system just stops working. And they would have food intolerance and even IV or parenteral food intolerance. I mean, they vomited because their GI system could not handle didn't have the energy to metabolize food in anything. So if you got to that point, if you got this GI dysfunction, or if you just have GI dysfunction in general because you have Crohn's or colitis or any of these things, and you can suspect that you probably are going to be deficient in thiamine. And if you wanted to get testing, there's one test in the US, or one lab in the US and one lab in the UK. That's it for the transketolase test, which is arguably the more accurate functional test because it looks at the enzyme activity versus what's just floating around in your bloodstream, which can, until you're severely deficient, what's floating around could fall within the reference ranges.
Is urinary organic acids, like having an elevated pyruvic and lactic acid in urinary organic acids, useful at all?
It's useful, yeah. But what I find interesting is that so that's more of a kind of an acute or early phase reaction. If someone has been chronically deficient, I mean, for just like we're bedridden, like we're talking chronic fatigue, that type of situation, we often see extremely low pyruvate to no pyruvate. So like the whole pathway shuts down. Everything it's like slow motion. And then there's other markers around that. So the fact that you don't have high pyruvate or high lactate does not exclude the possibility that you still need thiamine.
And how about serum thiamine? Is that a useful marker at all, or should that be?
Not usually, no, because it's very sensitive to what you've eaten over the last 24, 48 hours. And so if you've had a meal or supplemented vitamins, or you regularly supplement vitamins, then it's going to show that you're fine. And it may even show that you're fine for an extended period of time when you're clearly not,
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to just go back and touch on something you spoke about at the beginning, which was women's health. Mm-hmm. Is there a change in the way that research is being done now to include both men and women in large-scale trials?
Well, they say there is, but when you go back and you look at the data, there's not even female rodents in early phase trials. So it's not until the like phase 3 trials that they start to get women. And then the problem is they include women in the trials, but they don't do any sex-based analysis to see if there's any difference between the men and the women. They just check the box that we've had X number of women in the study, but they don't do any analysis whatsoever to see what the differences are between the two, between men and women. So no, not really.
Is there anything being done to change that? Like, are we?
Every now and again, something comes out in the news, and someone reacts, and there's a change. So after the Ambien study came out, they made a big deal at NIH. They had to include X number of women in this phase and that phase, but they they don't have the regulatory budgets, or they don't care to regulate whether or not they analyze any of the data. So when they come back, and you'll get these meta-analysis by subject. So, cardiology, immunology, this, and to look at the numbers of women in the study, and where, or in all studies, and where they were in the study, and whether or not the data were analyzed. It ends up being between 15 and 30% are actually analyzed. So, yeah, so no, not really.
Right. So you need to find a doctor who's really in the know and who's checking all of this.
Yes. And so as a woman, you really have to pay attention to this and understand that the dosing might not be right. The side effects are maybe entirely different for you. And so, yeah, and most adverse events are in women. So in most of the drugs that have been pulled from the market, the largest percentage of adverse events is from women.
Do you think that's why the companies choose to have mostly male subjects in their clinical
Well, it's
trials?
easier. It's certainly easier, yeah, and it's cleaner, and male animals, or they don't menstruate. You don't have to deal with any of that fluctuating hormones, or yeah, it's cheaper, it's easier, yeah, of course they do.
It's always something I look out for when I'm reading a trial. What the distribution of participants is, age and gender. Because
Well, yeah, and even if the distribution is okay, sometimes the distributions are okay, but they don't analyze it. And so what good is it to include all these if you're just going to leave that data, on the floor, so to speak? And that's the problem with
yeah. So in regards to thiamine use in clinical trials, have there been any real like landmark papers as far as using thiamine in different disorders and diseases?
Oh, actually, well, there's been a lot of research on thiamine and Alzheimer's. And in fact, there's a new one coming up, a new $5 million study. I can't remember whose lab is doing it, to look at the treatment of Alzheimer's with thiamine. Certainly, Constantini's work with Parkinson's work, but it's not a large-scale clinical trial by any sorts. It's his practice. He tabulated things and he continued to track it. But he showed remarkable results treating Parkinson's with thiamine. And then there's bits and pieces of this disease process, that disease process, diabetes, because they tend to excrete more thiamine in addition to the dietary component of eating higher carbs. Is problematic. So thiamine has been very useful in bringing down glucose levels, because obviously it uses glucose. So instead of it floating around in the cell, you're going to pull it into the mitochondria and turn it into energy. So there's been a lot on type 2 diabetes, a little less on type 1 diabetes. But it's really, because it is so integral to just life in general, it is implicated in everything that requires energy. And so, you ought to be thinking thiamine. If it's life requires energy, so you ought to be thinking, is my thiamine sufficient to meet the demands that I am putting my body under, so even healthy people, if they're under high stress, or athletes, under excessive training, probably need thiamine.
Is there a rationale for the idea that maybe everyone at some point in the modern world would benefit from some sort of thiamine supplementation, or is it possible that food can get us all the way?
I think the only way food can get us all the way is if you were to eat highly fortified foods, and if you were to eat highly fortified, then the demand is higher than the food can give. So it's this kind of negative cycle here. If you were to eat completely clean diet, I mean, completely organic, no exposure to pesticides, herbicides, and other things, no other exposures, it's possible that thiamine could get you through, and no medications, no, off the grid. If you were completely off the grid, then, yeah.
Well, I've noticed that organ meats are coming back into
Yes, they
a
are.
lot of people's diets. So that's likely going to help quite a bit. But yeah, I'm just not sure, given all of the exposures that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's why it's a little bit difficult it's very difficult to quantify whether you need a little bit extra or not. So if you do realize that you might need a little bit more, I noticed that there's a few different types of supplements out there. What are your takes on the regular thiamine HCl, benfotiamine, and the more expensive TTFD?
All good, but good for different reasons. HCl is a good starter thiamine, but it's where and it's good background maintenance thiamine for the average person who is not experiencing anything. But it's less potent than the other two, and it's not absorbed as well. But folks who have been chronically ill often have to begin there and have to be again at a very small dose of it. They'll have to open the capsule or get bulk supplements and dose it appropriately that way. If they can get past that, or if they want a more potent one, then either benfo or the allothymine, Thymax, or lipothiamine are fine, because those you can get more bang for your buck in terms of the ability to absorb it and the ability to get into the mitochondria, get into even the cell membranes. Because of the way they're designed. So thiamine in general has to be transported with a transporter. Many people have SNPs in these transporters and or are on medications that downregulate the transporters or so on and so forth. The benfo and the TTFD versions don't require transporters. And so those become the versions of choice when you have problems with absorption or transporter issues or anything like that, or genetic issues that are going to require a much higher dose over an extended period of time.
Are there any dietary factors that maybe enhance the function of these transporters?
Oh, that enhance? I don't know. I've always looked at the things that degrade them. I actually don't know.
I think there's it's a very small remark in the book that where these SNPs for thiamine transporters are more common, they consume foods that sort of compensate for that dysfunction, which I found quite interesting. The idea.
Well, certainly, yes, you could, yeah. And you can not only consume, but where the transporters are dysfunctional, you supplement. Because or where the enzyme is dysfunction, because even the enzymes that have genetic defects in them can be, to some extent, upregulated with a higher dose of its cofactor, whether it be a thiamine cofactor or any of the other nutrients. But if you upregulate that dose, you can kick that enzyme into gear to some effect and manage that problem. And that's something I think that we ought to spend a lot more time investigating across the board in all folks, because everybody has unidentified genetic defects that are making it difficult for them to absorb something. It's not just thiamine. And if we looked at the cofactors of some of these enzymes and things like that, I think that we could resolve a lot of health issues by just feeding them so that they can function better. But we don't look at nutrition at all.
Yeah, I've seen a few people who, when they get sick, they empty out a capsule or two of thiamine HCl into a big water bottle and they sip it throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's a really interesting way, slow dosing it throughout the day.
Yeah.
Is that maybe better than taking a capsule? Do you get better?
Well, it depends on the person. It really depends on what they can tolerate. And so, if you can tolerate a higher dose, you're going to need a higher dose I mean, most people are going to need a higher dose to heal, but it's whether or not you can tolerate it right out of the gate. And so, yes, if you can sip it across the day, eventually you'll get a fair amount in there. But how much of that is absorbed really? Because again, HCl is very poorly, it's like 8% of it's absorbed. So, 8% of 100 milligrams, 8 milligrams, and then across the day, you may not be getting very, but again, some people have to microdose. So it just is what it is. And you do what you can until you can handle a dose. So if someone is in the berry Wernicke's, kind of into the spectrum where they've already got damage, they're going to need a fairly high dose. And ideally, again, they would get IV. Wernicke's protocols are, depending on the severity of the Wernicke's, are anywhere from 200 to 500 milligrams of IV, 1 to 2 times a day for several days to a week, followed by an extended period of time of less dose and oral. And so if you're in that category and then you get a neurologist like the one I just mentioned and said, well, it's nutritional, I can't do anything, you're going to have to dose, because IV absorption obviously is 100%, whereas oral, 500 milligrams of oral is nothing. If the absorbability of HCl is so low. So you're going to probably need a Bemfo or a TTFD brand to get it up there, but you may not be able to handle it. And that's the problem, and you don't have a doctor to manage it with you. You may throw off your potassium, you may throw off your calcium, you may not have enough phosphorus. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's always difficult trying to balance all of those things with isolated nutrients. So, yeah,
it's
probably
very
a good
difficult
idea to keep an eye on it as you go.
Yeah.
Can gut microbes generate thiamine?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting about the gut and the microbes, well, the microbes anywhere in your body, frankly, is, again, every organism requires thiamine. So, and they derive it from different pathways. But the ones that are more pathological have salvage pathways, and they're much more adept in nutrient deprivation states of generating thiamine from these salvage pathways. And so that's why they thrive in nutrient deficient states, whereas those more beneficial microbes die off, and you get that kind of imbalance in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, considering that, in industrialized countries, we have about a third of the complexity in our microbiomes than our ancestors did. So I often wonder if we're subclinical thiamine deficiency just based off not having not much diversity in our gut to begin with.
I would suspect probably, yeah.
That's so interesting. And the substrates for that would be amino acids and
there's a variety of them, yeah. But again, it depends on whether it's the beneficial or that's such a bad term, beneficial, non-beneficial, but it really doesn't encapsulate what's going on. Yeah. But yeah, it depends. And sometimes there's some fatty acids. So like the microbes in the colon, it was long thought that the colon didn't produce any thiamine. But they do require fatty acids, and they have their own little transporter that takes it right in. And so we're learning more and more and more about the importance of the microbes and how they work with various nutrients. But it's fascinating.
And what are you working on at the moment, and what are you looking forward to seeing in the future?
Lately, I haven't been working on much, frankly, trying to keep my head above water, like a lot of folks. I have begun working with a foundation that intends to promote thiamine and work on thiamine related projects. And they have just sponsored their first research project. It's a study on mice relative to soy oils, seed oils, and how diet of seeds which is pervasive in the modern world. Seed oil is in everything, affects thiamine metabolism, the thiamine genetics, metabolomics, etc., and as well as some other indices. And so that's one project that's starting with this foundation that I've begun to work with. And they're also in negotiations with some other researchers to do thiamine and T cell function, and to develop thiamine testing, different thiamine testing capabilities, because the thiamine testing is really lacking. And so that's, I think, very exciting. And so that's where I've been focusing on some of my attention. They don't have a website yet, so you can't look them up in the background. But in the next year or so, you'll start seeing more thiamine-related research come out.
Awesome. And I'm gonna keep up to date with everything you do on hormonesmatter.com. Is that correct?
That's the website, yeah. And again, it sounds like an odd name for a website that does thiamine and mitochondria, but I began in women's health, and we began in endocrine research. So that's where it stuck, and we've stayed with it. So
awesome. I'm gonna let you go now because I know you're probably very busy, much busier than me. But I would encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book. It is...
Yes, please do. And even though the title is very scary and it is technical, we tried really hard to make it readable with case studies and kind of explanations of what's going on. So it is dense, but I think it provides a very useful framework for understanding health and illness. It's not just about thiamine. I mean, it certainly focuses, but it's a different way to understand health and disease.
Yeah, and the case studies alone would be like really, really worthwhile reading if that's all you can access. But I accidentally left this book on the bus one day, and someone handed it into the bus depot, and I went to pick it up, and the guy looked at it. He's like, "What the hell is this?" So, but I was very panicked to have lost it. But thankfully, I got it back because it had all my sticky notes in there.
It's the title is very, very scary. And so, if you can get past that, it is. And again, the case studies are interesting. That's why Hormones Matter is so useful, because we have so many case stories on that. But the interesting part about it is they're so diverse. And I think that's something we're not used to in medicine. We're used to having things look the same, this disease process looks like this. This one looks like that. This one looks like that. Well, when you're talking about a mitochondrial disease, which is effectively what thiamine deficiency is causing, that all goes out the window. And so you realize that our kind of artificial designation of disease may not be as useful as we think it is. And so that, I think, is one of the key take-home points, is that the disease is not as, neat and clean as we think it is.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end here. Everyone get a copy of the book and leave a review as well once you've read it. And,
yes, please.
And when you realize how useful it is, I think it's going to be a classic in the years to come. I think it'll be an absolute necessity. And I can't thank you enough for coming to speak with me, Chandler. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, thank you for having me.
All right. You take care.
You too.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to keep up with Chandler's work, I've put links to her channels in the episode notes. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and you can leave up to a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. This is a simple, no-cost way to support my work and help me reach more listeners. Please feel free to leave any comments on my YouTube channel, as I do read through as many as I can. I've put links to all of my social media platforms in the episode notes if you'd like updates about the podcast, information about health, or you'd just like to reach out to me. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Take care.